Hello, my name is Gabriel Bailey, and thank you very much for tuning into this presentation. I am a PhD student at the University of Glasgow at the School of Social and Political Sciences, as well as the Film and Television Studies department. I study videographic criticism and specifically the visual culture of the Anthropocene and cinema. Um, so in this presentation, I'm going to take you through a very broad overview of videographic criticism as a methodology, the various theoretical frameworks used, and then I'm going to talk through the idea of deformative criticism in videographic criticism before thinking a little bit about how videographic criticism can be valid. How do we judge the results of videographic research before finally bringing it through towards the concepts of the real on film and the Anthropocene. I'm going to be using videographic criticism methods in the second half, but I cannot show an actual videographic essay because it makes use of copyright material, which will get flagged when the video gets uploaded to YouTube. So what is videographic criticism? Videographic criticism is practice-based research. It generally consists of creating a video or manipulating pre-existing footage in order to produce new insights. It is highly subjective. It will typically be either a constructivist or interpretivist epistemology. From making a video essay is an inherently creative act of knowledge construction, which involves actively engaging with the original footage and allowing it to guide the direction of knowledge construction. However, it is highly subjective. So one of my favorite examples of this was in 2014, two video essayists decided to tackle the topic of women in Martin Scorsese films. So Nelson Carvajal made the first one, where he wanted to pay tribute to the way Scorsese would create these strong female characters who would fight back against the men who were domineering over them. And he was arguing that Scorsese was a kind of feminist filmmaker who wanted to show women and their struggles alongside men. Dina Fiasconaro responded to this essay with one of her own, where she was arguing that women are generally silenced, they are victims of abuse, and that they are marginalized in Scorsese films. These two artists had radically different interpretations of these same films, showcases the importance of a strong theoretical framework and the criteria for validity in videographic research. In some ways, these two video essays in conflict with each other produces a much stronger argument than either one does on their own. But it's what's so important about practice-based research is that the act of making is what generates knowledge. It is not an illustration of concepts that already exist. So typically, the way a video essay would do this is they would use montage to create a dialogue between clips that would not normally be seen together in order to generate new insights. So, as I stated on my last slide, the theoretical framework is absolutely key for any videographic research in order for it to be a piece of scholarship and not a creative exercise in how we can create new narratives and stories with other people's work. So this project is situated in the tradition of practice-based research in which the creative artifact functions as a primary site of epistemic inquiry. So unlike applied research, where creative practice is illustrating pre-existing theory, practice-based research holds that the act of making generates new knowledge that cannot be fully captured in written work alone. So this is echoed in the videographic criticism with the concept of material thinking, where the production of a video essay grants new insights into the films that would not be possible through conventional written analysis. This comes from a workshop that was led by Kristen Keithley, Jason Mattel, and Catherine Grant in 2014, where they brought together a wide range of practitioners in order to discuss and formalize some key concepts in videographic essays. So the key to this approach is Keithley's mantra of make first, think later. Insights are gained through the manual and computational manipulation of footage, allowing the scholar to move beyond the perspective of an audience member and analyze footage from a position closer to that of the filmmaker, so as one who handles, reorders, and transforms source material rather than observing it from a vantage point. This approach offers key advantages if you want to analyze production of films as well as their cultural impact. Now, deformative criticism, as described by 𝗔𝗯𝘀𝘁𝗿𝗰𝘁, is what we are going to focus on for the most part in the second half. So he defines it as computationally manipulated sounds and images to create new audiovisual artifacts whose impacts might be revealed through their aesthetic power and transformative strangeness. So in this sense, what we are trying to do is break apart these films, or in our case, screenshots from films, in order to see what is gained or lost once we have manipulated them and changed them in our specific way. So what is very important about deformative criticism is that we are guided by theory in order to break apart and change and render strange, in our case, quite classic films that you can expect an audience to be quite familiar with. So what makes a video a piece of videographic criticism rather than something along the lines of the clip show that was Seinfeld's 1000th episode? So Seinfeld's 1000th episode, for those of you who don't know, was just a collection of clips from the previous 999 episodes and was widely reviled by everyone who watched it. So for us as videographic essayists, how do we make sure that that is not what we are doing? So the first criteria is coherence. A videographic essay must follow a discernible, logical, argumentative arc. So despite the nature of montage as fragmented and nonlinear, a viewer should be able to trace how each sequence contributes to the overall thesis. This is based on Lincoln and Guba's concept of confirmability and Tracy's meaningful coherence, and we're trying to adapt that to the videographic medium. So if we take our example of that 1000th episode, there is no coherence and there is no argumentative arc whatsoever. That is just a series of clips that somebody found interesting. As videographic essayists, we cannot simply just take things that we find good and put them up on a screen. There has to be some kind of original argument being made. Now, we don't want to only be thinking about what is textually on the screen for our videographic essay. We also need to think about how we make it. How are we producing this? How are we editing it? So that takes us to the second criterion, which is reflexive transparency. So the constructive operations that produce the essay must be made visible and accountable. So this means we need to think about what software are we using? How are we selecting our footage? What editing techniques are we going to throw at this stuff to see what comes out of it afterwards? So this is adapted from Lather's idea of reflexive validity, as well as Denzin and Lincoln's principle that constructivist research must disclose its own interpretive labor. And especially in the context of making a video essay, the ways in which that we choose to cut and change and transform our materials and our original, our original source material is the act of producing knowledge. Like we said earlier in the theoretical framework, we are not illustrating other people's ideas. We are taking other people's ideas and then using that to create original interventions in the work, which then produce new insights. So these new insights are not judged by whether they provide final answers, but whether they provoke new, contestable, and productive ways of thinking. So catalytic validity refers to the capacity of research to reorient, focus, and energize viewers towards further inquiry. It's from Lather, 1986. So for our purposes, the project aims to reconfigure our understanding of these particular images once we take away certain elements of them and see if this reveals anything that might not have been present before. So now the final criteria is material grounding. So the constructed argument must be anchored in the material and historical specificities of the source media. This means respecting the archival provenance of film clips, acknowledging constraints of original context, and grounding interventions in theory. Practice-based research must be grounded in historically and culturally specific material practices, as well as 𝗔𝗯𝘀𝘁𝗿, 𝗔𝗯𘀃𝘁𝗁, and Catherine Grant's contention that videographic criticism constitutes valid inquiry only insofar as it respects the material boundaries of its source materials. So what we are arguing for here is that we need to be aware of the context in which these films were watched and produced when we are making these video essays. Otherwise, we are generating insights that are not relevant to their original context. So in this project that we're going to be looking at next, we're looking at films that were released in 1939. We have to be aware that our insights, if they are not applicable to the ways in which people were watching these films in those times, which is to say in a movie theater with no distractions and nowhere else, then they are not original insights into the way they were received in 1939, but insights into the way we receive these films today in 2026, which is not a bad thing necessarily, but it's something that we have to be aware of if our research is going to be valid. Are we trying to think about these films as products of their time and generate insights about the context in which they were produced, or are we trying to generate insights about the ways in which these films are remembered and treated today? So, for this study, we are going to look at painted backgrounds as a medium to think about how different realities converge on screen and how cinema creates a new reel. So what were these matte paintings? For those of you who don't know, it's one of my personal favorite little artifacts of film history where in the days before green screen and AI, they would have to cut out glass panes that they would then paint and hold in front of a camera using forced perspectives to create the illusion of grand backgrounds. Often it would be for outdoor landscape shots, but in the 70s and 80s, a lot of science fiction films would use this. We are going to be looking at films released in 1939 for this because it's a year where a lot of very famous films were released and almost all of them were using matte paintings. And it gives us a nice rich base of films to sample from. Now, there's one little detail I want to think about here. So we're going to look at a few of these paintings in the next few slides. But what's fascinating about these is that a lot of the time, the challenge for the artist would be to create a photoreal painting. But sometimes what they would do for other films, such as The Wizard of Oz, is that they would intentionally make the photographed element look not real so that it would blend in quite easily with the matte paintings. And a lot of them were able to have a lot of fun and experiment with the form. Here is our first screenshot of the day. So this is a freeze frame from the film The Return of Jesse James, which was directed by Fritz Lang in 1939. So feel free to have a look, pause the video, ask yourself, is this a photographed image or a superimposed painting? Did they go to the mountains and build a little town in order to film this wide shot of a street? Or did they build the town in a studio and put a glass pane in front of the camera and just use it as a matte painting? So feel free, as like I said before, to pause, look, see where does the painting might begin, where might the filmed footage begin, if you think there might be a painting in there. But like what I'd like to do is do a little show of hands and vote, but since this is recorded, I'm just going to give you another 10 seconds to look at the frame and see if you can spot anything. So, are you ready for the answer? It was a painting. I'm sure some of you figured that one out, but I would challenge any of you to go back and see how hard it is to actually find the border. I think thinking practically, it's pretty clear that they wouldn't have gone and built an entire set in the middle of a mountain, but I, for one, when I first looked at this frame, I was surprised to see that the tops of the buildings were actually also a painted background. And again, this is a little bit easier to tell when you can see the full image in motion. And you can look for, oh, well, this is moving around in this part of the set might be a little bit wobbly, but then the part on top of it is very stable. And you can see that they built kind of barriers into the set where there are kind of darker places at the tops of these buildings, which then function as convenient borders to separate the matte painting from the photographed image. Now that we've done our first piece of deformative criticism, it's worth coming back to the theory and thinking, well, what insights have we generated? So what we have done is we have split a frame of a film in half to show one part of it being painted and generated by a human, and one part of it was a photographed image. So what questions does this raise about these two realities that are existing and that are in conflict with each other, or maybe not, maybe they're supporting each other? Let's think about this. So since film was introduced in 1896, there has been a perception of cinema as an art form that promised to show its audience something real, would capture the real and put it on screen. A very famous example of this was when The Arrival of a Train was first shown in 1896 by the Lumiere brothers. Audiences are described as shrieking with surprise and delight and terror at this realistic train that was coming towards them. So it shows that this idea of truth is central to early cinema's narrative about itself and how it would get audiences to come to a theater and watch it. You were not just watching a painting, you were not reading an interpretation of it. The promise was you are watching history in front of you. Now, of course, philosophers have problematized the notion that there can be such a thing as a reel that is captured and screened for an audience for about as long as filmmakers are making that claim. Many critics, from Eisenstein in the 1920s to the Frankfurt School in the 1930s and 40s to the French post-structuralists in the second half of the 20th century, have each offered frameworks which think about the ways in which cinema challenges conventional notions of the real and how perspectives have to adapt in order to accommodate this shift. So we're going to be focusing on the post-structuralists who have broken down the ways in which we can think about the real on film. And one of the first to think about this and try and study it was 𝗔𝗯𝘀𝘁𝗿 in his book L'Univers filmique in 1954, where he tried to come up with his 7 levels of film reality. So he brought together a very diverse panel of film critics, priests, ballet directors, and academics who would outline these 7 layers. They were a filmic reality, the reality that exists independently of filmic reality. So for this presentation, that would be my whole room, where you are now, everything in the world is a filmic reality. Pro-filmic reality is the reality photographed by the camera. So that would be me sitting in a chair with a poster behind me and a bookshelf on my left. The filmographic reality, that would be the next layer, which is the film as physical object structured by techniques such as editing. This is a bit more complicated in the digital world, but when 𝗔𝗯𝘀𝘁𝗿 was thinking about this, he was thinking about the actual canister of film, which contains lots of spliced reels of film that were then printed into one thing that would then be projected onto a screen, which becomes the screenic reality, the film as projected on a screen. What are we literally looking at when we are staring at a wall illuminated by a film? Next comes diegetic reality, the fictional story world created by the film. This one's quite self-explanatory. Spectatorial reality, so the spectator's perception and comprehension of a film. How is it interpreted by the audience? What impact does it have on us? And finally, creational reality, so that is the filmmaker's intentions. So the method for finding these ideas was fairly simple. The panel would gather in a cinema. One member would screen several clips that relate to a theme that they had chosen, such as poetics, and then the panel would have a debate. 𝗔𝗯𝘀𝘁𝗿 was one of the principal figures associated with this branch of early film scholarship, which would come to be called filmology, and it aimed to establish the first comprehensive and systematic study of filmmaking as an art form, and establish terms that would become the foundation of future film scholarship. While it was very interesting, it failed to catch on in the way that 𝗔𝗯𝘀𝘁𝗿 and others wanted to, in part because they didn't really consider themselves specialists in film, but rather philosophers or aestheticians who wanted to come together and publish their thoughts on a new art form. So because of this, very little of their work is published under one person's name, and their conclusions and language are quite general. That being said, it would prove very influential for 𝗔𝗯𝘀𝘁𝗿 and a lot of the French New Wave critics who would come out in the 60s and 70s. Now, moving on, I want to think about Baudrillard and his work on the hyperreal. So in his work, Simulacra and Simulation, he explores the relationship between reality, symbols, and society, and the ways in which they create a shared cultural understanding of the world. Similar to 𝗔𝗀𝘀𝘁, he argues that an image goes through successive phases. First as a reflection of reality, then as it masks and denatures reality, then it masks the absence of a profound reality, before finally it has no relation whatsoever to reality and is its own pure simulacrum. Baudrillard's work theorizes how an image becomes decoupled from the thing it is supposed to represent, and the process of generating a real without origin or reality, a hyperreal. Within the context of mass media, Baudrillard is arguing that the media is effectively able to create a paradigm that is able to replace people's perceived objective reality. So this idea of multiple conflicting realities and spaces coexisting on film, as described by the last two scholars, brings to mind Foucault's work on the heterotopia, first discussed in The Order of Things in 1966. He described heterotopias as worlds within worlds, spaces which encompass contradictory ideas and purify them. This would be taken up by the new media scholar 𝗔𝗯𝘀𝘁𝗿 in 2012, who conceptualized cinema as a heterotopia, especially in the digital world, arguing that film labor, having globalized in the 21st century with prominent visual effects studios using labor from the global south to bring to life worlds in the global north, using green screens and other visual effects, created a new kind of digital heterotopia. Now, having done our deformative criticism of The Return of Jesse James, I think that there is scope to make an argument for a kind of analog heterotopia that existed in pre-digital film, where there would be this conflict between the photographed human world and then the human-generated, painted, non-human in the background. So building on the scholarship that we just went over in the reel about the conflict between this human-created artificial natural and the photographed world of the human world that exists on that heterotopia, that, as if we accept that framework that I just described, that brings to mind some ideas around the Anthropocene for me. So I'm going to give a very short overview of the Anthropocene with this still from the film Northwest Passage, and you can judge while I'm talking if you think this is a photographed image or a painting. So the Anthropocene is closely associated with the rise of capitalism and the creation of a distinction between the wild and civilization. It's often conceived as a kind of blowback for the failure to respect the relationship between human civilization and non-human. As the scientific consensus around climate change grew more and more undeniable, the term Anthropocene began to gain increasing popularity as a descriptor for a new geological epoch. In the American context, people in the late 1930s who have been very aware of how the landscape can be uprooted and transformed by human activity, first by the Civil War and Reconstruction still under living memory, before witnessing cities such as Chicago and Los Angeles grow from small towns into some of the largest cities in the world over a span of just a few decades, as described by Earl Ellis in 2018. This was a seismic change in environmental consciousness over a very short period of time. And at the same time as these new cities were being built, mass media was taking over as well, meaning that, as 𝗔𝗯𝘀𝘁𝗿 states, this shift in environmental consciousness was being shaped to an unprecedented degree by powerful bourgeois interests. So what does this mean for the world of videographic criticism in the real, as we said before? Well, it shows that cinema, as we've seen in our deconstructive criticism that we did before, cinema is this place where there are these distinctions between the human and the non-human, and this human-influenced natural. And so therefore, there is a very powerful metaphor that is built in there that we can, I am arguing, that we would be able to bring out with videographic methods. And for any of you who are wondering, this mountain was in fact photographed. To sum up, deformative criticism has allowed us to create new insights about the ways in which reality is constructed on film. These insights allowed us to create new testable hypotheses for videographic essays that explore the Anthropocene on film in further study. Film also creates a new heterotopia that exists in the shared space between photography and paintings, as exemplified by this clip from Gone with the Wind. This is one of my favorite clips of any film I've ever seen because it completely defies interpretation. It's very clear that the people in the foreground are photographed, and it's very clear that the paintings and the house in the background are painted. However, the people who are photographed are riding up the road into a painted house. I have spent an enormous amount of time trying to find the boundary between the painted reality and the photographed reality, and I'm not able to. If you're able to do it by watching this video back and find a boundary, please tell me, because it has confounded me for a very long time. But thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to continuing to discuss videographic methods with you in the discussion after the presentation. Thank you very much.